Some wounds never fully heal. They just learn to live quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the right touch to remind us we're still alive. Isabelle Dawson thought her heart had been buried with her husband 5 years ago, until a young cowboy named Lucas rode onto her Wyoming ranch. He's 29 and has never been with a woman. She's 50 and forgotten what it feels like to be wanted. When their worlds collide under the endless prairie sky, both will discover that love doesn't follow the rules of age or experience. But can a virgin cowboy and a grieving widow find healing in each other's arms? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Dawson ranch as Isabelle pulled on her late husband's worn leather work gloves, the same ritual she'd performed every dawn for the past 5 years. The gloves were too large for her hands, the leather cracked and softened by countless seasons of Thomas's grip, but she couldn't bring herself to replace them. They were a tangible piece of him, a weight that reminded her of duty, of the life they'd built together in this unforgiving Wyoming landscape. She stood on the wraparound porch of the 2-story farmhouse, surveying the land that stretched toward the horizon like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. 2,000 acres of grazing land, a modest herd of cattle, and a reputation for quality horses, everything Thomas had dreamed of when they'd arrived here as newlyweds 25 years ago. Back then, she'd been Eleanor May Patterson, a banker's daughter from Cheyenne with soft hands and romantic notions about frontier life. Now she was Isabelle Dawson, a woman whose hands knew the weight of feed buckets and the gentle pressure needed to calm a spooked mare. The morning routine was sacred. Check the horses first. Their 12-stall barn housed some of the finest quarter horses in the county. Thomas had been a master with horses, seeing potential in wild mustangs that others would have given up on. She'd learned from him, developing an intuition for their moods and needs that surprised even the most experienced horsemen in town. The horses responded to her quiet confidence, her steady presence that never demanded but always commanded respect. "Morning, Belle," called out Jeremiah Thorne, her foreman, as he emerged from the barn leading Thunder, her prize stallion. At 62, Jeremiah had worked the ranch longer than anyone, his weathered face telling stories of countless seasons under the Wyoming sun. He was one of the few people who still called her by the nickname Thomas had used, and she allowed it because Jeremiah had earned the right through decades of loyalty. "How's Thunder's leg this morning?" she asked, noting the slight favor the stallion had shown his left front hoof yesterday. "Sound as $1. That poultice you mixed up did the trick." Jeremiah's approval carried weight. He'd been skeptical when Thomas died, uncertain whether a woman could manage the ranch's day-to-day operations. 5 years had proven her capable, though she sometimes caught him watching her with the protective concern of a father. The other hands were already at work. Miguel Santos, a quiet man in his 40s, whose family had worked cattle in Mexico before crossing north, handled their small herd with an almost mystical understanding. His son, Diego, barely 18, was learning the trade with the same patient dedication his father had shown. There was also Frank Morrison, a former cavalry soldier, whose steady reliability made up for his tendency toward drink on Saturday nights. The ranch employed 6 men full-time, with seasonal help during branding and roundup. It was a smaller operation than the sprawling spreads owned by men like Garrett Blackwood, whose Double B ranch dominated the valley, but it was profitable, and more importantly, it was hers. The townspeople of Cedar Falls respected her business acumen, even if they whispered about her personal choices. Those whispers followed her everywhere. At the Mercantile, where Martha Kellins would ask pointed questions about why a woman her age remained unmarried. At church, where Reverend Holbrook's wife Patricia would mention eligible widowers with the persistence of a missionary. At the monthly Cattlemen's Association meetings, where her opinions were heard, but her solitude was noted with concern that bordered on judgment. "A woman needs protection," Patricia Holbrook had said just last week after service. "The frontier is no place for a lady alone. regardless of how capable she might be. Isabelle had smiled politely, as she always did. But inside, she'd wanted to ask exactly what kind of protection Patricia thought she needed. The ranch's books were balanced, her fences were strong, her livestock was healthy, and her reputation for fair dealing was unquestioned. She could shoot as straight as any man, and had done so on the occasions when wolves or mountain cats threatened her animals. What more protection did a woman require than her own competence and the respect of those who worked for her? But she understood the town's concern, even if she resented it. In 1885, a 50-year-old widow was an anomaly that upset the natural order of things. Women were meant to be protected, provided for, guided by masculine wisdom. The fact that she managed perfectly well on her own suggested either that men weren't as necessary as everyone believed, or that she wasn't as feminine as a proper woman should be. Neither possibility sat well with the good citizens of Cedar Falls. The irony was that she'd loved being married, had thrived in the partnership she and Thomas had built. He'd been her anchor and her wings, encouraging her strength while providing the steady presence she'd craved. Their marriage had been built on mutual respect and genuine affection that had deepened over the years into something unshakable. When pneumonia took him during a particularly harsh winter, she'd felt as though half of her soul had been torn away. The first year after his death had been the hardest. Not just the grief, though that had threatened to drown her, but the constant pressure to sell the ranch and move back to town, to find another husband, to stop pretending she could manage alone. Thomas's brother Samuel had been particularly insistent, arriving from Denver with offers from potential buyers and lectures about a woman's proper place. Thomas wouldn't have wanted you struggling like this, Samuel had said, standing in the very kitchen where she now prepared breakfast for her hands. He'd want you cared for, secure. I am secure, she'd replied, though her voice had shaken with exhaustion and uncertainty. This ranch is my security. It had taken 3 years to prove herself completely, to reach the point where even Samuel stopped offering rescue. The ranch not only survived under her management, it prospered. She'd expanded the horse operation, improved the bloodlines through careful breeding, and established contracts with the army post that provided steady income. The cattlemen who'd initially patronized her now sought her advice on breeding, stock, and pasture management. But success came with its own isolation. The townspeople respected her, but from a distance that felt increasingly lonely. The women saw her as either pitiable or threatening. Pitiable if they thought she was struggling alone, threatening if they recognized how well she was managing without masculine guidance. Men treated her with a careful courtesy that acknowledged her success while maintaining proper boundaries. She was invited to social functions, but as a curiosity, not as a woman who might dance or laugh or feel the warmth of admiration in another person's eyes. She missed being seen as a woman, not just the physical intimacy she'd shared with Thomas, though she missed that more than she cared to admit, but the small recognitions of her femininity. The way Thomas's eyes had lit up when she wore her blue dress to church. The gentle touch of his hand on her back when he passed behind her chair. The knowledge that someone in the world found her beautiful, desirable, worth cherishing. At 50, she sometimes wondered if that part of her life was simply over. Her mirror showed her a woman still handsome, with clear green eyes and auburn hair that held only threads of silver. But mirrors couldn't tell her if anyone else would ever see her that way again. The few widowers who'd shown interest had wanted a housekeeper and hostess, someone to manage their domestic affairs while they handled the important business of men. None had looked at her with the spark of genuine desire, the recognition of a woman worth pursuing rather than simply acquiring. The morning light grew stronger as she made her way to the henhouse, gathering eggs while the chickens complained about the early hour. This routine grounded her, the simple tasks that connected her to the rhythm of the land. Later, she'd ride out to check the south pasture where they'd moved the cattle last week. After that, a trip to town for supplies and the weekly torture of polite conversation with women who measured their lives by their husbands' accomplishments. But first, There was the matter of the new hand Jeremiah had mentioned needing. One of their seasonal workers had taken a job with the railroad, and spring work was demanding more help than their regular crew could handle. She trusted Jeremiah's judgment about men. He had an eye for character that came from decades of reading people, but the final decision would be hers. It was her ranch, her responsibility, and her reputation that would be affected by whoever they hired. She didn't know, as she gathered the last of the eggs and headed back toward the house, that before the morning was over, a young cowboy named Lucas Rivers would ride into her carefully ordered world and change everything she thought she knew about second chances and the stubborn persistence of the human heart. She didn't know that love, which she'd assumed was a chapter of her life already written and closed, was preparing to surprise her with an entirely new story. All she knew, as she pulled off Thomas's gloves and prepared to face another day, was that life had become a series of tasks to be completed rather than moments to be savored. And somewhere deep in her heart, beneath the layers of duty and propriety and resigned acceptance, a small voice whispered that perhaps, if she was very quiet and didn't frighten it away, there might still be more to discover about what it meant to be fully alive. The ranch house itself stood as a testament to the dreams she and Thomas had shared. Built of local stone and timber, with wide windows that caught both morning and evening light, it had been designed to last generations. The parlor still held the piano Thomas had surprised her with on their 10th anniversary, though she rarely played anymore. Music seemed too joyful for a house that held only memories. The kitchen remained the heart of the home, its long oak table scarred by countless meals shared with ranch hands and neighbors. Its cast-iron stove, reliable as sunrise. Thomas's study remained untouched, his books still arranged exactly as he'd left them. Agricultural journals, poetry volumes, and the leather-bound ledgers where he'd recorded every detail of the ranch's operations. Sometimes she'd sit in his chair and breathe in the faint scent of his tobacco that still lingered in the fabric after all these years. It wasn't morbid, she told herself, it was remembrance. But she wondered sometimes if the difference mattered. Her bedroom, their bedroom, had been harder to navigate. She'd moved to the guest room after the first terrible year, unable to sleep in the bed they'd shared without dreaming of his presence beside her. But lately, she'd found herself standing in the doorway, looking at the morning light falling across the quilted coverlet her mother had made as a wedding gift. The room felt less like a shrine now, and more like a space waiting for permission to be inhabited again. The town of Cedar Falls lay 10 miles east, nestled in a valley where the river made a lazy bend through cottonwoods and willows. It was growing slowly but steadily as the railroad brought new settlers and new opportunities. The main street boasted a hotel, 2 saloons, a mercantile, a church, and the offices of Dr. Benjamin Cross, who served as both physician and unofficial keeper of the community's secrets. There was talk of a school, though for now children were taught in the church basement by whoever was available and willing. Isabelle knew every family in town, their histories and their struggles. The Morrisons had lost their eldest son to diphtheria 2 winters past. The O'Briens were struggling to make their farm profitable in soil better suited to grazing than crops. Widow Hartwell raised her 3 daughters alone after her husband died in a mining accident, taking in sewing and laundry to make ends meet. These were her people, bound together by the shared challenges of life on the frontier. Yet she often felt like an observer rather than a participant in their community. Part of her isolation was geographical. The ranch's distance from town meant she missed the daily interactions that built deeper friendships. But part of it was the careful way people treated successful women who lived outside conventional expectations. They admired her competence while questioning her choices, praised her independence while pitying her solitude. It was a delicate balance that left everyone, including Isabelle, uncertain about exactly where she belonged in the social fabric of Cedar Falls. The church provided structure, if not comfort. Reverend Holbrook was a good man. His sermons practical, rather than fire and brimstone, focused on community responsibility and Christian charity. But his wife Patricia had appointed herself the guardian of social propriety, with particular attention to unmarried women over 40. Patricia's suggestions always came wrapped in concern and Christian duty, making them impossible to refuse without seeming ungrateful or prideful. "I've been praying for you, dear," Patricia would say after service, her hand warm and persistent on Isabelle's arm. "The Lord doesn't intend for us to walk through life alone. There's Mr. Garrett in town, such a kind widower, and his children are grown. Or that nice Mr. Patterson who's opened the new feed store. A woman needs companionship, especially as we age." Isabelle had learned to smile and nod, offering vague promises to consider Patricia's suggestions, while privately wondering if the woman had ever asked herself what kind of companionship might actually bring joy rather than just social acceptability. The widowers Patricia recommended were decent men looking for practical arrangements, someone to cook their meals and manage their households. None had looked at her with curiosity about her thoughts, admiration for her accomplishments, or interest in the woman she'd become through years of independence and responsibility. The ranch's financial success gave her security and respect, but it also set her apart. Other widows in the county had sold their land or remarried quickly, following the expected path. Her choice to stay and prosper alone was viewed as either admirable determination or stubborn pride, depending on who was doing the viewing. The men who came to buy her horses or cattle treated her with careful formality, acknowledging her business acumen while maintaining the proper distance between a lady and gentleman. Conducting commerce, she missed the easy camaraderie she'd once shared with Thomas and their friends, the dinner parties where conversation flowed as freely as wine, the shared laughter over small domestic disasters, the comfortable intimacy of married couples who trusted each other completely. Now her social interactions felt choreographed, each person playing their assigned role in the careful dance of frontier respectability. The seasonal rhythms of ranch life provided their own comfort. Spring brought calving and the excitement of new life, the careful monitoring of pregnant mares, the first sweet grass after winter's harsh grip. Summer meant long days in the saddle, checking fence lines and water sources, the satisfaction of seeing healthy cattle grow fat on good pasture. Fall brought roundup and the controlled chaos of sorting, branding, and preparing for winter. And winter, harsh, demanding, beautiful winter, required a different kind of strength. The patience to endure and the faith that spring would come again. She'd learned to find meaning in these rhythms, to measure her life by the successful completion of each season's demands, rather than by the companionship she'd lost. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was a life she'd built with her own hands and mind. That had to count for something, even if the counting sometimes felt lonely in the evening hours when the work was done, and the house settled into silence around her. Standing on her porch now, watching Jeremiah work thunder in the corral, she felt the familiar mix of pride and solitude that defined her days. The ranch was thriving, her reputation was solid, her future was secure. She had everything a sensible woman could want, everything society said should make her content. If contentment sometimes felt like resignation, and if security sometimes felt like a beautifully appointed prison, well, those were thoughts for the quiet hours when no one was watching, and expectations didn't require her to be grateful for what she had, rather than yearning for what she'd lost. But change, as it often does, was already riding toward her across the Wyoming plains, in the form of a young man whose innocence and sincerity would challenge everything she'd accepted about the shape her life had taken. And perhaps, if she was brave enough to believe in impossible things, she might discover that contentment was only the beginning of what a woman could hope for, not the end. The rider appeared on the horizon just after 10 o'clock, a dark silhouette against the endless blue of the Wyoming sky. Isabelle noticed him from the kitchen window where she was kneading bread dough. her hands working the familiar rhythm while her eyes tracked the approaching figure. Visitors were rare enough to warrant attention, especially lone riders who moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in the saddle. Jeremiah emerged from the barn, his hand instinctively checking the position of his sidearm, a habit from decades of frontier living where strangers could mean opportunity or trouble in equal measure. But his posture relaxed as the rider drew closer, revealing a young man on a well-maintained bay gelding, his gear neat and his approach unhurried. This wasn't a man running from anything or riding toward violence. Isabelle wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch, studying the newcomer with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to judge character quickly and accurately. He was tall and lean, probably in his late 20s, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that were clean, but showed the wear of long days in the saddle. His horse was a good one, not expensive, but well cared for. The mark of a man who understood that his mount was his most important possession. "Good morning," he called out as he approached, his voice carrying a slight accent that might have been Texas or maybe just the generic drawl of someone who'd traveled widely across the frontier. He touched the brim of his hat in the gesture of respect that every cowboy learned early and never forgot. "I'm looking for the Dawson Ranch." "You found it," Jeremiah replied, stepping forward to take the lead in the conversation. It was proper protocol. The foreman handled initial contact with strangers, while the ranch owner observed and evaluated. "Name's Lucas Rivers," the young man said, dismounting with fluid grace and extending his hand to Jeremiah. "I heard in town you might be looking for an extra hand." Jeremiah shook the offered hand, his experienced grip testing the calluses and strength that told their own story about a man's work history. "Might be. Depends on what you can do and where you've been doing it." Lucas reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a folded piece of paper, a letter of recommendation, worn from being carried but still legible. "Worked the last 2 years for the Bar M outside Laramie. Before that, the rocking chair down in Colorado. Started learning horses and cattle when I was 14. Isabelle found herself studying his face as he spoke, noting the honest directness of his gaze and the way he stood, confident but not cocky, ready to prove himself without making claims he couldn't back up. There was something almost innocent about his expression, a quality that seemed unusual in a man his age who'd spent years drifting from ranch to ranch. "What brings you north?" Jeremiah asked, unfolding the letter and scanning its contents. "Heard good things about this country," Lucas replied. "Man gets tired of moving on every season. Looking for a place that might feel like home if I prove myself worth keeping." The simple honesty of the statement hit Isabelle unexpectedly. How many years had it been since she'd heard someone speak so directly about wanting to belong somewhere? Most of the hands they hired were either running from something or saving money for something else. Here was a young man who simply wanted to find his place in the world. "Boss?" Jeremiah looked toward the porch, obviously impressed by whatever the letter contained. "This here's from Jack Morrison at the Bar M. Says Lucas is the best horse handler he's seen in 20 years, never missed a day of work, and honest as the day is long. Says he'd hire him back in a heartbeat if he hadn't sold the ranch." Isabelle stepped down from the porch, aware that her presence would change the dynamic of the conversation. Ranch hands expected to work for the men who owned the land, and some had difficulty adjusting to taking orders from a woman. She'd learned to establish her authority clearly from the beginning, before attitudes could harden into problems. "Mr. Rivers," she said, offering her hand in the same businesslike manner she used with all potential employees. "I'm Isabelle Dawson. This is my ranch." His hand was warm and firm, with the deep calluses of someone who'd spent years working with rope and reins. But what struck her was the way his eyes widened slightly when she introduced herself, not with the skepticism or confusion she'd grown accustomed to, but with what looked almost like recognition, as though he'd been hoping to find exactly this situation. "Ma'am," he said, holding her hand perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary, "it would be an honor to work for you." Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. There was respect in his voice, but also something warmer, an appreciation that went beyond mere politeness. When had someone last looked at her that way, as though seeing her was a pleasant surprise rather than a business necessity? "We pay $30 a month plus room and board," she found herself saying, though she'd intended to question him more thoroughly first. "You'll bunk with the other hands, work 6 days a week, Sunday afternoon off unless there's an emergency. We expect honesty, reliability, and respect for the animals and the land." "Yes, ma'am. That sounds more than fair. You'll start tomorrow if you're agreeable. Jeremiah will show you to the bunkhouse and explain the routine." She turned to go back to the house, then paused. "Mr. Rivers, what made you choose the Dawson Ranch specifically? There are larger spreads in the area with more opportunities for advancement." He seemed to consider his answer carefully, looking out across the pastures where her horses grazed in the morning sun. "Sometimes bigger isn't better, Mrs. Dawson. Sometimes a man just knows when he's found the right place." The words lingered in the air between them, carrying more weight than seemed reasonable for such a simple statement. Isabelle felt heat rise in her cheeks and turned quickly toward the house, confused by her own reaction. It had been a perfectly appropriate response from a potential employee, nothing more, but as she climbed the porch steps, she was acutely aware of his presence behind her, of the way he'd looked at her as though she were someone worth seeing, rather than simply someone who happened to own the ranch he wanted to work for. It had been so long since a man had looked at her that way, with interest, with appreciation, with the recognition that she was a woman as well as a ranch owner. The realization disturbed her more than it should have. Lucas Rivers was nearly young enough to be her son, a drifter looking for work, completely inappropriate for any kind of personal attention. Whatever she'd thought she'd seen in his eyes was probably her own imagination, the wishful thinking of a lonely woman reading too much into simple courtesy. From the kitchen window, she watched Jeremiah lead Lucas toward the bunkhouse, pointing out various buildings and explaining the layout of the ranch. The young man listened attentively, asking sensible questions about the horses and the work routine. He moved with easy confidence, comfortable in his own skin, in a way that suggested he'd found his calling in ranch work. But there had been something else in his manner during their brief conversation, a quality she couldn't quite define. Not the careful deference most hands showed when meeting a female ranch owner for the first time, but not presumptuous familiarity either. He'd treated her with respect, certainly, but also with a warmth that felt personal rather than professional. She told herself she was being foolish. Lucas Rivers was a working cowboy looking for steady employment, nothing more. The fact that he was handsome, well-spoken, and apparently skilled at his trade didn't change the fundamental inappropriateness of her noticing those qualities. She was 50 years old, a respectable widow, a pillar of the community. She had no business feeling flustered by a young man's smile or reading meaning into polite conversation. But as she returned to her bread dough, she found her thoughts drifting back to the moment when he'd taken her hand, to the way his eyes had lit up when he'd realized she owned the ranch, to his comment about finding the right place. Something about Lucas Rivers had unsettled the careful order of her world, and she wasn't sure whether that was a development to welcome or to fear. Change, she'd learned, rarely announced itself with fanfare. More often it arrived quietly, in the form of a young cowboy with honest eyes and work-worn hands, carrying nothing more dangerous than a letter of recommendation and a hope for somewhere to belong. But sometimes the quietest changes were the ones that transformed everything. 3 weeks later, Isabelle had to admit that hiring Lucas Rivers had been one of her better decisions, even if it hadn't brought the peace of mind she'd expected. He'd proven everything Jack Morrison's letter had claimed: reliable, skilled, and possessed of an almost mystical understanding of horses that impressed even Jeremiah. But what the letter hadn't mentioned, and what was slowly driving Isabelle to distraction, was the way Lucas seemed to see straight through the careful walls she'd built around herself. It started with small things. The wooden bird carving she'd found on the kitchen windowsill after the first week, delicately crafted from a piece of pine during his evening hours. When she'd asked Jeremiah about it, he'd shrugged and mentioned that Lucas liked to whittle, had a real gift for it. The carving was beautiful, a meadowlark with its wings spread in flight, every feather detailed with patient precision. "Thought you might like it," Lucas had said when she'd thanked him, his cheeks coloring slightly. "Noticed you watching the birds at breakfast sometimes. Figured you were partial to them." The fact that he'd noticed her morning routine, that he'd paid attention to something as simple as her enjoyment of the meadowlarks that sang from the fence posts, unsettled her in ways she couldn't quite articulate. When had someone last cared enough to notice what brought her small pleasures? His work spoke for itself. The horses responded to him with an eagerness that bordered on devotion, and even thunder, temperamental at the best of times, seemed to calm in Lucas's presence. He had a gift for reading their moods, understanding what they needed before they showed distress or discomfort. Jeremiah had started consulting him on breeding decisions, a level of respect rarely granted to new hands. "That boy's got the touch," Miguel had commented in his quiet way, watching Lucas gentle a particularly fractious mare. "Some men fight the horses, some men fear them. That one listens to them." With the cattle, Lucas showed the same intuitive understanding. He could read the herd's mood, spot sickness or injury before it became obvious, and had an uncanny ability to predict which direction spooked cattle would run. Frank Morrison, initially skeptical of the young newcomer, had grudgingly admitted that Lucas knew his business better than most men twice his age. But it was during the daily routine that Isabelle found herself most aware of him. He had a way of appearing when she needed help, lifting heavy feed sacks without being asked, steadying a ladder when she climbed to check the barn roof, offering his horse when hers threw a shoe 15 miles from home. The help was always offered casually, without fuss or expectation of special thanks, as though helping her was simply the natural thing to do. More disturbing were the moments when she'd catch him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. Not the careful assessment of a ranch hand evaluating his employer, but something warmer and more personal. Once, while she was working with a young colt in the corral, she'd looked up to find him leaning against the fence. His attention focused entirely on her, with a small smile playing around his mouth. "Something amusing, Mr. Rivers?" she'd asked, trying to keep her tone light. "No, ma'am," he'd replied, but the smile had deepened. "Just admiring good horsemanship. That colt's never going to give you trouble. He already trusts you completely." The compliment had pleased her more than it should have, especially coming from someone whose own skill with horses was becoming legendary among the hands. She'd felt herself flush and had turned back to the colt to hide her reaction, annoyed with herself for caring about the opinion of a man young enough to be her son. The problem was that Lucas didn't act like a young man. His conversation showed depth and thoughtfulness that surprised her, and his observations about ranch management were often insightful enough that she found herself genuinely interested in his opinions. During the evening hours, when the work was done and the hands sat on the bunkhouse porch talking and playing cards, she'd sometimes hear him reading aloud poetry, she thought, though she couldn't make out the words from the house. "Where did you learn to read like that?" she'd asked one evening when she'd walked down to discuss the next day's work with Jeremiah and overheard Lucas finishing. "What sounded like Shakespeare. Books were about the only thing my guardian left me when he died," Lucas had replied without embarrassment. "Figured if he thought they were worth keeping, they were worth reading. Poetry helps pass the long evenings, and some of the other hands like listening to stories." The image of this young cowboy reading Hamlet to a group of rough ranch hands was so incongruous that she'd smiled despite herself. Lucas had noticed her amusement and grinned back, and for a moment the age difference between them had seemed irrelevant. He was simply a person she enjoyed talking to, someone whose company was comfortable and engaging. Those were the dangerous moments when she forgot to maintain the proper distance between employer and employee, when she let herself enjoy his conversation and attention as a woman rather than as a boss. Because in those moments she could almost pretend that the way he looked at her meant what she thought it might mean, that his small kindnesses were motivated by something more personal than mere courtesy. The town had begun to notice him, of course. Cedar Falls was too small for a handsome young stranger to pass unremarked, especially one working for the widow Dawson. She'd heard the speculation at church, the wondering about where he'd come from, and whether he might be suitable for one of the unmarried daughters in town. Martha Kellins had made pointed comments about how nice it must be to have such capable help, while Patricia Holbrook had observed with false casualness that young men who read poetry might make fine husbands for the right woman. The comments stung more than they should have. Lucas Rivers wasn't hers to claim or protect, and the assumption that any unmarried man was fair game for the town's matchmaking efforts was perfectly reasonable. If she felt possessive about his attention, that was her problem, not theirs, but she couldn't help noticing that Lucas seemed politely uninterested in the young women who found excuses to visit the ranch or who made themselves conspicuous when he came to town for supplies. He was courteous, but distant, treating them with the same respectful friendliness he showed everyone else. His real attention, the warmth that made her pulse quicken, seemed reserved for her alone. That couldn't be right, of course. She had to be misreading the situation, letting her own loneliness color her perception of what was simply a good employee's professional consideration. Lucas Rivers was a young man with his whole life ahead of him. He had no business being interested in a widow 20 years his senior, and she had no business encouraging such an impossible situation, even if it existed. But late at night, when the ranch was quiet and she sat on her porch, listening to the distant sound of his voice, reading to the other hands, she allowed herself to wonder what it would be like to be the recipient of that gentle attention, to have someone care enough to carve her small gifts and notice what made her smile. It was a dangerous indulgence, she knew, but sometimes the heart insisted on its foolish hopes, despite the mind's better judgment. The evening conversations began by accident, born from a chance encounter on the porch when Isabelle stepped outside to enjoy the sunset and found Lucas sitting on the steps, apparently doing the same thing. Thomas's old medicine bottle had fallen from her apron pocket as she sat down, rolling across the wooden planks with a hollow rattle that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet air. "Sorry," she murmured, reaching for the bottle, but Lucas was quicker, his fingers closing around the amber glass before handing it back to her with careful gentleness. "Headache powders?" he asked, his tone carrying genuine concern rather than mere politeness. "Something like that," she replied, not ready to explain that she'd been carrying the bottle since finding it while cleaning Thomas's study that morning, a tangible reminder of his mortality and, by extension, her own. The discovery had triggered a flood of memories about their life together, their plans for the future that illness had cut short, and the guilt she felt about slowly letting go of grief that had once felt like the only way to honor his memory. "My guardian used to get terrible headaches after his injury," Lucas said, settling back onto the steps as though he'd been invited to stay. War wound that never healed right. He said sometimes the pain wasn't in his head at all, it was in his heart, and his head was just the place it decided to settle. The observation was so unexpectedly perceptive that Isabelle found herself really looking at him, noting the way the evening light caught the gold flecks in his brown eyes and softened the strong line of his jaw. There was an old soul quality about him that seemed at odds with his young face, a depth of understanding that spoke of experiences beyond his years. "Tell me about him," she said, surprising herself with the request. "Your guardian, James Morrison, no relation to Jack Morrison who wrote my letter, just one of those coincidences. He took me in when I was 14, and my parents died of typhoid. James had been a schoolteacher before the war, fought with the Colorado Volunteers until a Confederate bullet scrambled his brains enough that he couldn't remember poetry the way he used to. That's when he decided teaching other people's children wasn't for him anymore. But he could still teach one orphan boy how to read and think and treat the world with respect." Lucas's voice carried the kind of affection reserved for people who'd shaped us fundamentally, and Isabelle found herself drawn into the story despite her better judgment. "He sounds like a remarkable man," he was. "Died 3 years ago, left me his books and his horse and enough money to get by for a while. That's when I started drifting, I guess, looking for something that felt like home again." He glanced at her with that direct honesty she was learning to recognize. "Think I might have found it?" The simple statement hung between them, loaded with implications that made Isabelle's pulse quicken, even as her rational mind urged caution. He couldn't mean what she thought he might mean, and even if he did, acting on such feelings would be impossible for countless reasons. "The ranch is a good place," she said carefully, keeping her tone neutral. "The work is honest, the country is beautiful, and the men who work here tend to stay for years if they're suited to it. It's not just the ranch." "Mrs. Dawson," Lucas said quietly, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Though I suppose I shouldn't say more than that. She should have ended the conversation there. Should have reminded him of the proper boundaries between employer and employee. Should have retreated to the safety of the house before this dangerous moment could develop further. Instead, she found herself asking, "Why shouldn't you?" "Because you're a lady deserving of respect, and I'm just a cowboy with more feelings than sense. Because there's 20 years between us and a world of difference in what we've seen of life. Because I've got no right to look at you the way I do, or think the things I think when I should be concentrating on my work." His honesty was devastating in its simplicity. No flowery speeches or practiced seduction, just the straightforward admission of a man who'd been wrestling with feelings he knew were inappropriate. Isabelle felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight control she'd maintained over her emotions for so long. "What do you think, Lucas?" The question escaped before she could stop it, his first name feeling strange and intimate on her tongue. "I think you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, and the strongest, and the kindest. I think watching you work with the horses is like watching poetry in motion. I think the sound of your laugh is worth more than gold, and I'd do just about anything to hear it more often." He paused, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture of nervous honesty. "And I think I'm a damn fool for telling you any of that." The words hit her like a physical force, stirring feelings she'd thought buried with Thomas. When had someone last called her beautiful and meant it? When had anyone looked at her with the kind of admiration she saw in Lucas's eyes, not for what she could provide or the convenience she might represent, but simply for who she was? "Lucas," she began, then stopped, unsure what she could possibly say that wouldn't either encourage something impossible or crush something precious. "I know," he said, saving her from the necessity of response. "I know all the reasons it's impossible. I'm not asking for anything. Mrs. Dawson, I just wanted you to know that someone sees you, really sees you, and thinks you're worth celebrating." They sat in silence as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Isabelle felt tears threaten, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being truly seen by another person after years of careful invisibility. Whatever this was between them, whatever it might become or fail to become, Lucas had given her a gift more valuable than he probably realized. "I should go in," she said finally. Though she made no move to leave, "Probably should," he agreed. But his voice held no urgency, no expectation that she would actually go. Instead, she found herself telling him about Thomas, about the medicine bottle and the memories it carried, about the guilt of healing and the fear of forgetting. He listened without judgment, offering the kind of understanding that had nothing to do with age or experience, and everything to do with the quality of attention he paid to the people he cared about. When she finally stood to go inside, Lucas rose with her, steadying her elbow as she navigated the porch steps in the growing darkness. His touch was brief and respectful, but it sent warmth shooting up her arm and reminded her how long it had been since she'd been touched by gentle hands. "Good night, Isabelle," he said softly, and hearing her name in his voice felt like a small revolution. "Good night, Lucas," she replied, and knew that something fundamental had changed between them, something that could never quite be unchanged again. The pressed wildflower appeared on her desk 3 days later, a delicate prairie rose, carefully preserved between two pieces of thin glass. Isabelle found it while reviewing the ranch's account books, the morning light catching the translucent petals and casting shadows that looked like lace against the wooden surface. "I noticed you mentioned missing your garden," Lucas said from the doorway, hat in his hands and that familiar flush coloring his neck. "Thought maybe you'd like a piece of the prairie to keep indoors until you can plant flowers again." The gesture was so thoughtful, so perfectly attuned to a passing comment she'd made about the flower beds Thomas had helped her plant behind the house, that she felt her carefully maintained composure wobble dangerously. "It's beautiful, Lucas. Thank you. There's a whole field of them about 2 miles south, near the creek where we moved the cattle last week. If you'd like, I could show you sometime." The invitation was casual enough, but his eyes held the same hopeful intensity she was learning to recognize. "That would be nice," she heard herself saying, though every rational thought screamed that spending time alone with him away from the ranch was exactly the kind of mistake she couldn't afford to make. The truth was that Lucas Rivers had begun occupying entirely too much space in her thoughts. She found herself timing her morning routines to coincide with his, lingering over breakfast preparations so she could watch him work with the horses through the kitchen window. The evening conversations had become a regular occurrence, both of them gravitating toward the porch as though drawn by forces beyond their control. Their talks ranged from practical matters, ranch management, horse breeding, the best grazing areas for different seasons, to topics she hadn't discussed with anyone in years. Literature, philosophy, the dreams that drove people to seek new lives on the frontier. Lucas's education might have been unconventional, but his mind was sharp and curious, his observations often surprising her with their insight. "You ever think about what you'd do if money wasn't a consideration?" he'd asked one evening, whittling another small carving while they watched the stars emerge. "Travel, maybe," she'd replied, surprised by the admission. "See the ocean, visit the cities I used to read about. Thomas and I always said we'd take a trip back east once the ranch was well established, but somehow there was always another crisis, another reason to postpone it." "What's stopping you now?" The question had caught her off guard. "Responsibility, I suppose. The ranch needs constant attention, and I can't just abandon it for a pleasure trip. Could if you had the right person to leave it with," Lucas had said quietly, his knife pausing in its work. "Someone you trusted completely." The implications of the statement had sent heat racing through her veins. Was he suggesting he might be that person someday? Was he thinking in terms of a future that included both of them? The possibility was both thrilling and terrifying, but it was Garrett Blackwood's visit that forced her to confront just how complicated her situation was becoming. The owner of the Double B Ranch had been circling her property for years, with the patient persistence of a man who knew that every ranch eventually came up for sale. His arrival on a Tuesday morning, dressed in his finest suit and riding his most expensive horse, suggested this wasn't a casual social call. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, dismounting with the careful dignity of a man in his 60s who no longer moved as easily as he once had. "I hope you'll forgive the unannounced visit, but I have a proposition that I believe deserves your immediate consideration." Garrett was everything the town thought she should want in a second husband. Wealthy, established, respectable. He owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, had successfully raised 4 children after his wife's death, and commanded the kind of respect that came from decades of sound business decisions. He was also boring as dust and possessed all the romantic sensibilities of a fence post. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood, would you like to come inside for coffee? That's kind of you, but I prefer to conduct business outdoors when possible." He glanced around the ranch with the assessing eye of someone mentally calculating values and possibilities. "I've been watching your operation for some time now, and I must say, you've done remarkable work keeping it profitable after your husband's passing." The compliment felt patronizing rather than genuine. as though her success was surprising given her gender rather than impressive given her skill. Thomas built a solid foundation. I've simply tried to maintain it, indeed. But maintaining and growing are different challenges, aren't they? I'm prepared to make you an offer that would provide you with financial security while relieving you of the burdens of daily management. Isabelle kept her expression neutral, though inwardly she bristled at the assumption that running her ranch was a burden rather than a choice. I'm not looking to sell, Mr. Blackwood, not sell, merge. I'm proposing marriage, Mrs. Dawson, a business arrangement that would benefit us both. You'd have the protection and companionship of a husband, access to the resources of the Double B, and freedom from the constant worry of managing alone. In return, I'd gain an experienced partner and access to your excellent grazing land. The proposal was exactly what she'd expected from Garrett. Practical, bloodless, focused entirely on mutual advantage rather than any pretense of affection. She was opening her mouth to decline politely when Lucas appeared around the corner of the barn, leading Thunder toward the corral. Your new hand seems capable, Garrett observed, following her gaze. Young, though. You have to be careful with young men, Mrs. Dawson. They tend to get ideas above their station, especially when working for a woman alone. The comment hit like a slap, its implications clear despite the polite language. Somehow, Garrett had heard the town gossip, had noticed whatever was developing between her and Lucas, and was warning her about the impropriety of the situation. Worse, he was probably right, from the town's perspective. Her growing attachment to her young employee was exactly the kind of scandal that proved widows needed masculine guidance. My employees conduct themselves appropriately, Mr. Blackwood, she said coldly. I'm sure they do. But appearances matter, especially for a woman in your position. Marriage would end any speculation about your situation here. The threat was veiled, but unmistakable. Refuse his proposal, and he'd make sure the town's whispers became loud enough to damage her reputation. Accept, and she'd be safely contained within conventional expectations once again. I'll need time to consider your offer, she said, hating herself for not refusing outright. Of course, but don't take too long, my dear. Opportunities like this don't remain open indefinitely. After Garrett left, Isabelle stood on her porch, feeling as though the walls of her carefully constructed life were closing in. Marriage to him would solve her practical problems, while destroying everything that mattered to her. But refusing might mean facing social ostracism that could affect not just her, but everyone who worked for her. Lucas approached the house as evening fell, obviously intending their usual conversation, but stopped when he saw her expression. Bad news? He asked quietly. Complicated news, she replied, then found herself telling him about Garrett's proposal, despite knowing she shouldn't burden him with such personal concerns. Lucas listened without interruption, his face growing more serious with each detail. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains that caught the last light of day. What do you want to do? He asked finally. I want to tell him to go to hell, she said, then blushed at her own language. But it's not that simple. Why not? Because he's right about appearances. Because people are talking about us, and my reputation affects everyone who works here. Because maybe it would be better for everyone if I just accepted the inevitable. Lucas turned to face her fully, his eyes intense in the gathering dusk. Is that what you really believe? That settling for a loveless marriage is better than fighting for what you actually want. What I want isn't possible, Lucas. Surely you see that. I see a woman who's convinced herself that other people's opinions matter more than her own happiness. I see someone who's survived loss and built something beautiful with her own hands, and who's about to throw it all away because it's easier than standing up for herself. His words stung because they contained enough truth to hurt, but they also contained a challenge that made her heart race with dangerous possibilities. The locket had belonged to her mother, a delicate gold oval that contained tiny photographs of her parents as newlyweds. Isabelle discovered it while sorting through Thomas's effects. Somehow, it had found its way into his desk drawer, probably placed there for safekeeping, and then forgotten during the chaos of his final illness. The photographs showed her parents at 22 and 18, respectively, their faces bright with the optimism of young love and new marriage. What struck her most was how happy they looked together, despite the 16-year age difference that had scandalized her maternal grandmother and prompted whispered speculation throughout their courtship. Her mother had been barely out of schooling when she'd fallen in love with the established banker who would become Isabelle's father. Their marriage had lasted 43 years, ending only with her mother's death from consumption when Isabelle was 32. She'd never thought much about the age gap between her parents, had accepted their love story as simply the natural order of her family's history. But now, holding their images and remembering their devotion to each other, she found herself wondering why society's rules about appropriate matches seemed to shift depending on which direction the years flowed. The town's pressure had intensified since Garrett's visit, though the criticism came wrapped in concern and Christian duty as always. Patricia Holbrook had made a point of mentioning how fortunate Isabelle was to have attracted the attention of such an established man, while Martha Kellins had observed with false casualness that ranch work was getting too demanding for a woman of Isabelle's age to manage alone. Even Dr. Cross had weighed in during her visit to town for supplies, suggesting with medical authority that women approaching their 50s needed the security and companionship that only marriage could provide. The message was clear: accept Garrett's proposal or face increasing social isolation until she had no choice but to capitulate. But it was the treatment Lucas received that truly opened her eyes to the vindictive nature of small-town righteousness. She'd witnessed it herself during their trip to town for ranch supplies, watching as respectable matrons pulled their daughters away from his polite greetings and shopkeepers served him with barely concealed hostility. Boy's getting above himself, she'd overheard Frank Patterson say to another customer at the feed store. Working for a woman alone gives some men ideas about their place in the world. The comment had made her blood boil, partly for the disrespect shown to Lucas, and partly for the assumption that she was too weak or foolish to manage her own affairs. But Lucas had handled the slight with dignity, completing his purchases without acknowledging the rudeness and helping her load supplies with the same courtesy he'd always shown. It wasn't until they were driving back to the ranch that she'd seen the cost of the town's disapproval in the tight line of his shoulders and the careful neutrality of his expression. "I'm sorry," she'd said impulsively. "The way they treated you was inexcusable." "It's not your fault," he'd replied, but his voice carried a weariness that spoke of accumulated hurts. "They're protecting you from the scandal of associating with someone beneath your station. Can't really blame them for that. I can and do blame them. You're worth 10 of any man in that town." The fierce defense had surprised them both, but Lucas's smile in response had been worth the impropriety of the statement. For a moment, the careful distance they'd been trying to maintain had evaporated, leaving only the warmth of mutual regard and the dangerous intimacy of shared persecution. The crisis came during a thunderstorm that struck without warning on a Thursday afternoon. Isabelle had been in the barn checking on a mare close to foaling when the sky opened up with the sudden violence that characterized Wyoming weather. The wind picked up with frightening speed, turning rain into horizontal sheets that made visibility nearly impossible. Thunder lived up to his name during storms, becoming fractious and dangerous as the lightning crashed overhead. The stallion was in his stall, but the wooden walls wouldn't contain him if he panicked completely. Isabelle could hear him screaming challenges at the thunder, his hooves striking the walls with impacts that shook the entire barn. She was trying to calm him when she heard the crack of splintering wood and realized he'd broken through the stall door. 1,500 pounds of terrified horse in an enclosed space was a deadly situation, especially with the other animals already spooked by the storm. Lucas appeared as though summoned, moving with calm purpose despite the chaos. He didn't try to grab Thunder's halter or force a confrontation. Instead, he began talking to the stallion in a voice that somehow carried over the storm's noise. Steady and soothing and utterly fearless. Easy, big man. Nothing here's going to hurt you. Just a little noise from the sky. Nothing that's going to last. To Isabelle's amazement, thunder began to settle, his ears flicking toward Lucas's voice even as lightning continued to split the sky. Gradually, the horse allowed himself to be led toward an empty stall, though his muscles remained tense and ready to bolt. "Stay with him," Lucas told her quietly. "He trusts you, and your voice will keep him calm. I need to check the other animals." For the next hour, they worked together to manage the storm's effects, calming frightened horses, checking for damage, ensuring that the cattle in the near pasture had found adequate shelter. Lucas moved through it all with competence that impressed even Jeremiah, taking charge when necessary, but never assuming authority that wasn't his to claim. When the storm finally passed, leaving the air clean and electric with possibility, Isabelle found herself looking at Lucas with new eyes. He'd proven himself under pressure, shown leadership and courage that had nothing to do with age or experience and everything to do with character. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing the words were inadequate for what he'd done. No thanks needed. This is what partners do, take care of each other when things get rough. Partners. The word hung between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond their professional relationship. Isabelle felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the constraints she'd placed on her own desires that evening. As they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, she found herself speaking without censoring her thoughts. "Lucas, what you said about fighting for what I want, what if what I want is impossible?" "Nothing's impossible if you're willing to pay the price for it," he replied, his eyes serious in the gathering dusk. "The question is whether you think it's worth the cost." She looked at him, really looked, seeing not the young cowboy, the town dismissed, but the man who'd proven his worth through actions rather than words. Someone who saw her not as a burden to be managed or a prize to be won, but as a partner worthy of respect and capable of making her own choices. "I think," she said carefully, "that some things are worth fighting for, regardless of what other people think." His smile was like sunrise, warm and full of promise. "Then maybe it's time to stop letting other people decide what's right for your life." The hidden deed changed everything. Lucas found it by accident while helping Isabelle organize Thomas's study, a task they'd finally undertaken together as she began the long process of making the room truly hers, rather than a shrine to her late husband. The document had been tucked between the pages of a volume of Tennyson poetry, the legal paper yellowed with age and bearing a date that made Isabelle's hands tremble as she read. 1865, she whispered, staring at the marriage certificate that bore her name, not as Isabelle Dawson, but as Isabel Patterson Morrison, wed to one James Morrison at the age of 24. How did this get here? Lucas studied the document with growing understanding, pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. James Morrison. My guardian's name was James Morrison. The coincidence was too extraordinary to be mere chance. As they compared details, dates, locations, the distinctive handwriting that Lucas recognized from his guardian's letters, the truth became undeniably clear. James Morrison, the former schoolteacher who'd raised Lucas after his parents' death, had been Isabelle's first husband, the man she'd married in the aftermath of the Civil War and lost to frontier violence after just 2 years. He never mentioned you, Lucas said quietly, his voice filled with wonder and something that might have been grief. All those years, and he never said he'd been married. I couldn't talk about him either, Isabelle replied, sinking into Thomas's chair as memories she'd buried for decades came flooding back. Thomas knew, of course, but we agreed that the past should stay buried. Losing James nearly destroyed me. I convinced myself that forgetting was the only way to heal. The revelation recontextualized everything they'd shared, adding layers of meaning to connections that had seemed miraculous in their intensity. Lucas had been drawn to her not just by attraction, but by some deeper recognition, a familiarity that transcended conscious memory. She'd responded to him with trust that had seemed inexplicably natural, as though some part of her had known he carried traces of a love she'd thought lost forever. He talked about a woman sometimes, Lucas admitted, his eyes distant with recollection. Never gave details, but he'd get this look, sad and proud at the same time. Said she'd been the best thing that ever happened to him, and losing her had been the worst. I always assumed she'd died. I did die in a way, Isabelle said, her voice thick with unshed tears. The woman who loved James Morrison died when he did. Isabelle Patterson survived, but she was too broken to trust that kind of love again until Thomas came along and put her back together. The discovery explained so much about their connection, but it also complicated everything. How could she pursue a relationship with the man who'd been raised by her first husband? What did it mean that fate had brought them together through such an impossible coincidence? Was their attraction real, or simply the echo of old grief seeking resolution? This doesn't change anything, Lucas said firmly, as though reading her doubts. What I feel for you has nothing to do with James or the past. I fell in love with the woman you are now, not the girl you used to be. But even as he spoke the words, Isabelle could see the uncertainty in his eyes. The revelation had shaken him too, forcing him to question whether his feelings were genuine or somehow influenced by the connection to his guardian. The simple clarity of their growing love had become tangled with implications neither of them knew how to navigate. The timing couldn't have been worse. Garrett Blackwood had grown impatient with her delay in responding to his proposal and had begun applying pressure through channels she hadn't expected. Legal channels? There's been a complaint filed with the territorial court, Dr. Cross informed her, during what she'd assumed was a routine visit to check on a ranch hand's injury. Questions about your management of the ranch, suggestions that a woman alone might not be capable of maintaining proper stewardship of such valuable land. The words hit like a physical blow. On what grounds? Financial irregularities, allegedly. Nothing specific, but enough to warrant an investigation. I'm sorry, Isabelle, I tried to discourage the inquiry. But once these things gain momentum, he trailed off. His expression apologetic but helpless. She knew without being told who was behind the complaint. Garrett had the connections and resources to make legal trouble. And more importantly, he had the social standing to make his concerns seem legitimate rather than vindictive. A respected rancher worried about a widow's ability to manage. Valuable land would be taken seriously by territorial authorities who already believed women needed masculine guidance. The investigation would scrutinize every aspect of her ranch management, looking for evidence of incompetence or impropriety. Her books were immaculate, her operations profitable, but bureaucrats predisposed to find fault would discover problems where none existed. Worse, the mere existence of the investigation would damage her reputation and validate the town's whispers about her unsuitability for independence. How long do I have? She asked. The investigator arrives next week. Garrett suggested that marriage would resolve the concerns immediately. A husband's oversight would satisfy the court that proper management was assured. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Accept Garrett's proposal and the legal problems would disappear. Refuse and face the loss of everything she'd worked to build. Either way, her independence would be destroyed. That evening she shared the news with Lucas, watching his face grow hard with anger as she explained the situation. He can't just steal your ranch, Lucas said, his voice tight with controlled fury. He's not stealing it. He's forcing me to choose between marriage and potential ruin. Legally, it's perfectly sound. Morally, she shrugged, too exhausted to find words for her disgust. There has to be another way. Some legal recourse, some way to fight back. With what resources? Garrett has money and connections I can't match. Even if I could prove this is retaliation for refusing his proposal, the investigation itself will accomplish his purpose. They sat in silence as darkness fell around them, both understanding that they were facing the end of something that had barely begun. The hidden deed had raised questions about the nature of their connection, but Garrett's legal maneuvering had made those questions irrelevant. Whatever future they might have imagined together was being crushed by forces beyond their control. "Marry me," Lucas said suddenly, his voice quiet but determined. "Lucas, I'm serious. If the problem is that you need a husband to satisfy legal requirements, then marry me. I know it's not what either of us planned, but it would solve the immediate crisis and give us time to figure out the rest." The proposal was both everything she'd dreamed of and nothing like what she'd hoped for. Marriage to Lucas would indeed resolve the legal challenges, but it would also trap them both in a relationship born from desperation rather than choice. How could she be sure his offer came from love rather than gallant protectiveness? How could he be certain her acceptance wasn't just grateful compliance? "The town would never accept it," she said, though her heart was already leaping toward the possibility. A 50-year-old widow marrying her 29-year-old ranch hand? The scandal would destroy us both. Let them talk. We know the truth about what we feel for each other, and that's what matters. Is it the truth, though? This revelation about James, the pressure from Garrett. How can we be sure our feelings are real when everything else is so complicated? Lucas was quiet for a long moment, his face serious in the moonlight. "Do you remember what you told me about James? About how losing him nearly destroyed you?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "I felt that way when I thought I might lose you to Garrett's proposal. Not because of any connection to my guardian, but because the thought of watching you marry someone else made me want to saddle my horse and ride until I forgot what happiness felt like." Jim. He reached for her hand, his fingers warm and steady around hers. "That's not the echo of old grief, Isabelle. That's love, messy and complicated and probably inconvenient, but real." The sincerity in his voice cut through her doubts like sunlight through storm clouds. Whatever had brought them together, coincidence, fate, or the mysterious workings of hearts that refused to accept conventional limitations, what they felt for each other had grown beyond its origins. "If I say yes," she said carefully, "it can't be just to solve the legal problems. It has to be because we both believe this is what we want, regardless of the consequences." "Then say yes because you love me," Lucas replied, his eyes holding hers with unwavering intensity. "Say yes because you want to build a life together, not because Garrett Blackwood is trying to force your hand. Say yes because you believe in us." Looking into his face, seeing the hope and determination and genuine devotion there, Isabelle felt the last of her reservations crumble. The town would be scandalized, Garrett would be furious, and the road ahead would be difficult. But for the first time in years, she was being offered the chance to choose love over security, passion over propriety, her own happiness over everyone else's expectations. "Yes," she said, and watched his face transform with joy. "Yes, I'll marry you, Lucas Rivers. Not to save the ranch or spite Garrett or satisfy the territorial authorities. I'll marry you because I love you and because life's too short to waste on anything less than extraordinary." His kiss was gentle and reverent, a seal on promises that would be tested by every challenge ahead. But in that moment, surrounded by the vast Wyoming night and the infinite possibilities of love that refused to follow rules, Isabelle knew they'd found something worth fighting for. The morning Isabelle removed Thomas's wedding ring from her finger marked the beginning of the end of one life and the start of another. She'd worn the simple gold band for 30 years, 10 as his wife and 20 as his widow, and its absence felt strange and significant as she prepared for the confrontation that would determine her future. The territorial investigator had arrived as scheduled, a thin, officious man named Morrison Hartwell, who'd made his sympathies clear within minutes of his introduction. He'd spent 3 days scrutinizing her books, interviewing her employees, and examining every aspect of the ranch's operations with the prejudiced eye of someone looking for evidence of female incompetence rather than actual irregularities. "Your records are quite thorough, Mrs. Dawson," he'd admitted grudgingly after completing his review. "Though I must say, some of these management decisions seem rather ambitious for a woman operating without masculine oversight. The condescension in his voice had made Isabelle's hands clench, but she'd maintained her composure with the patience learned from years of dealing with men who assumed her gender, made her inferior. "Which decisions concern you specifically, Mr. Hartwell? This expansion of the horse breeding program, for instance. The investment in new bloodlines represents significant financial risk. A more conservative approach might be prudent. The breeding program has increased our profits by 30% over the past 3 years," she'd replied coolly. "The Army contracts alone justify the investment, and our reputation for quality stock has attracted buyers from as far as Denver." But facts, she was learning, mattered less than preconceptions when those preconceptions aligned with legal and social prejudices. Hartwell had continued to question decisions that any reasonable person would recognize as sound business practice, his skepticism clearly influenced by his meetings with Garrett Blackwood and other concerned citizens who'd expressed worry about her management capabilities. The town meeting had been called ostensibly to address community concerns about the ranch's future, but everyone understood its real purpose. Cedar Falls would decide whether to support Isabelle's independence or endorse Garrett's claim that she needed masculine protection. The outcome would influence Hartwell's final report and determine whether she could continue operating the ranch on her own terms. Jeremiah had been the first to declare his loyalty, his weathered face grim with determination as he'd made his position clear. "Been working this ranch for 15 years, and I've never seen it run better than it is right now. Any man who says Mrs. Dawson can't manage her own affairs is either blind or lying." Miguel had nodded his agreement, his quiet dignity adding weight to Jeremiah's endorsement. "She knows cattle, she knows horses, and she knows people. The ranch prospers because she makes good decisions." Even Frank Morrison, despite his occasional drinking and general skepticism about female authority, had grudgingly acknowledged her competence. "Don't much like taking orders from a woman," he'd admitted. "But I like eating regular and getting paid on time." Mrs. Dawson's never failed to do right by the men who work for her. But the most unexpected support had come from Lucas himself, who'd requested permission to address the investigator formally despite the risk to his own position. His defense of her management had been both passionate and precisely detailed, demonstrating knowledge of ranch operations that impressed even her critics. "Mrs. Dawson doesn't just give orders," he'd told Hartwell with quiet intensity. "She works alongside us, knows every animal on the place by name, and makes decisions based on 25 years of experience with this land. Any investigation that questions her competence is investigating the wrong things." The loyalty of her employees had been gratifying, but Isabelle knew it wouldn't be enough to overcome the social pressure building against her. Patricia Holbrook had organized the concerned citizens with the efficiency of a military campaign, gathering testimonials about the impropriety of a woman living alone with hired men and the scandal of her apparent attachment to Lucas. "It's not natural," Patricia had declared to anyone willing to listen. "A woman her age carrying on with a boy young enough to be her son. Something needs to be done before the situation becomes completely unseemly." The whispers had grown louder and more vicious as news of the investigation spread. Stories about late-night conversations on her porch, about the special attention Lucas received, about the impropriety of their working relationship had taken on lives of their own. By the time these tales reached territorial authorities, they'd been transformed into evidence of moral corruption that justified questions about her fitness to manage valuable land. Garrett, meanwhile, had positioned himself as the reluctant savior, a respected man willing to sacrifice his own comfort to resolve a difficult situation through marriage. His supporters portrayed him as almost saintly in his willingness to take responsibility. For a woman who'd obviously lost her way, it's not Mrs. Dawson's fault, she'd overheard Martha Kellens saying at the Mercantile. Grief can affect a woman's judgment, especially when she's been alone too long. Mr. Blackwood is offering her a chance to regain her respectability. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. These same people had praised her business acumen for years, had sought her advice on livestock and land management, had acknowledged her success in maintaining one of the county's most profitable operations. But the moment her personal life deviated from their expectations, her professional competence was suddenly in question. The evening before the town meeting, Isabelle sat on her porch with Lucas, both of them aware that they were facing a battle that would determine not just their future together, but her right to live according to her own choices. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Lucas asked, his voice steady despite the tension she could see in his shoulders. "As ready as anyone can be for public judgment," she replied, surprised by her own calm. "Either we convince them that love doesn't follow their rules, or we find somewhere else to be happy. You'd leave the ranch." The question carried undertones of guilt, as though he blamed himself for putting her in a position where such sacrifices might be necessary. "I'd leave anything that stood between us and the life we want to build together," she said firmly. "This land is important to me, but it's not more important than you. If Cedar Falls can't accept us as we are, then perhaps we don't belong in Cedar Falls." But even as she spoke the words, she felt the pain of potentially losing the life she'd built with such care. The ranch represented more than property or investment. It was the tangible proof of her competence, the foundation of her independence, the legacy she'd hoped to leave. Walking away would mean abandoning not just land, but identity. Lucas seemed to understand her internal struggle. "We won't have to leave," he said with quiet confidence. "Tomorrow, when people see us together and hear what we have to say, they'll understand that what we have is real and worth defending." His faith was touching. But Isabelle had lived long enough to know that people often chose comfortable prejudices over inconvenient truths. Still, his certainty gave her strength, reminding her that whatever happened tomorrow, she wouldn't face it alone. They'd spent the evening making final preparations, reviewing the ranch's financial records one more time, discussing their strategy for the meeting, and acknowledging the possibility that they might need to start over somewhere else. But mostly they'd simply sat together, drawing comfort from each other's presence as they prepared for the most important fight of their lives. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Lucas said as they prepared to go inside, "I want you to know that loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life. Even if we lose everything else, we'll still have that." Isabelle felt tears threaten at the simple beauty of his words. "I love you too, Lucas Rivers, more than I thought possible, more than I believed I deserved." Their kiss goodnight carried the weight of promises and possibilities, of a love that had surprised them both with its depth and intensity. Tomorrow, they would stand before their community and defend their right to choose happiness over convention. Tonight, they simply held each other and marveled at the miracle of finding love when neither had been looking for it. The ring she'd removed that morning sat on her dresser, a symbol of her past that she'd finally found the courage to set aside. In its place, she wore only the hope that tomorrow would bring the freedom to embrace a future she'd never dared to imagine. But regardless of what the town decided, she knew she'd already won the most important battle, the one against her own fear of living fully again. The Cedar Falls Community Hall had never held so many people, their voices creating a low buzz of anticipation and judgment that filled the wooden building like smoke. Isabelle entered with her head held high, Lucas beside her and her ranch deed, the legal document that represented 25 years of her life, clutched in her hand like a talisman. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. She was fighting not just for love, but for the right to own her own destiny. Territorial investigator Morrison Hartwell sat at the front of the room with the uncomfortable bearing of a man who discovered that his assignment was more complex than anticipated. His 3 days on the ranch had revealed financial records more meticulous than those kept by most male ranchers. Operations run with efficiency that impressed even his prejudiced expectations, and employee loyalty that spoke to leadership skills rather than feminine weakness. But the social pressure surrounding the investigation had grown beyond simple questions of ranch management. What had begun as Garrett Blackwood's calculated attempt to force a marriage proposal had evolved into a community-wide debate about proper behavior, feminine roles, and the dangerous precedent of allowing women too much independence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reverend Holbrook called the meeting to order, his usually gentle demeanor strained by the controversy that had divided his congregation. "We're here to address concerns raised about the management of the Dawson Ranch and to seek a resolution that serves the best interests of all parties involved." Garrett rose first, his presence commanding immediate attention. Dressed in his finest suit and carrying himself with the authority of Cedar Falls' most successful rancher, he presented the image of masculine competence that the community expected from its leaders. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his voice carrying the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "We've gathered tonight because we care about one of our own. Isabelle Dawson has shown remarkable courage in maintaining her ranch after her husband's death. But courage alone isn't enough to manage the complexities of modern ranching." His words were carefully chosen, acknowledging her efforts while undermining confidence in her continued success. "The territorial government has expressed legitimate concerns about the concentration of valuable land under the management of someone who, through no fault of her own, lacks the experience and support necessary for long-term stewardship." Murmurs of agreement rippled through portions of the crowd, heads nodding in response to arguments that sounded reasonable when stripped of their vindictive motivations. Garrett had positioned himself skillfully, not as a man pursuing his own interests, but as a community leader, responding to legitimate governmental concerns. "Mrs. Dawson's situation has become complicated by personal attachments that raise questions about her judgment," he continued, his gaze flickering toward Lucas with calculated disapproval. "A woman alone is vulnerable to influence from those who might not have her best interests at heart. Marriage would provide the stability and guidance necessary to resolve these concerns while protecting everyone involved." The accusation was elegantly veiled but unmistakable. Lucas was being portrayed as a fortune hunter, Isabelle as a lonely widow whose judgment had been compromised by inappropriate affections. The narrative was designed to make Garrett's marriage proposal seem like rescue rather than coercion. Martha Kellins stood to voice her support, her words reinforcing the theme of protective concern. "We've all watched Mrs. Dawson struggle to maintain her independence, and we admire her for it. But admiration doesn't change the reality that ranching is demanding work that requires masculine strength and experience. Mr. Blackwood's offer would ensure that the ranch continues to prosper while providing Mrs. Dawson with the companionship she deserves." Patricia Holbrook added her voice to the chorus, invoking Christian duty and community responsibility. "It's not appropriate for a woman of Mrs. Dawson's standing to live alone with hired men, especially when one of those men is young enough to be her son. The situation invites gossip that damages not just her reputation, but the moral climate of our entire community." The attacks continued, each speaker adding weight to the argument that Isabelle needed to be saved from her own poor judgment. But she noticed that the opposition wasn't unanimous. Faces in the crowd showed discomfort with the proceedings, and several people she'd counted as friends looked embarrassed by the public humiliation she was facing. Dr. Cross surprised everyone by standing to offer a different perspective. "I've known the Dawson family for 15 years, and I can attest to Isabelle's competence in all matters relating to ranch management. Her books are impeccable, her animals are healthy, and her reputation for fair dealing is unquestioned. If we're going to discuss her fitness to manage her own affairs, we should base that discussion on facts rather than speculation about her personal life." His statement created a stir, providing the first public defense of her management capabilities from someone whose opinion carried professional weight. Jeremiah seized the momentum, rising despite his discomfort with public speaking. Worked for Thomas Dawson for 10 years, and I've worked for Mrs. Dawson for 5 more, he said, his weathered voice carrying clearly through the room. Never seen the ranch run better than it is right now. Woman knows cattle, knows horses, and knows how to make the hard decisions that keep an operation profitable. The tide seemed to be shifting slightly, creating space for defenders to voice their support. But Isabelle knew that the real confrontation hadn't yet begun. The community would hear from both sides, but ultimately the decision would rest with territorial authorities who'd been influenced by the same prejudices that had created this situation. Everything depended on what happened next. Lucas rose to his feet with quiet dignity, and the room fell silent with surprise. Ranch hands didn't typically speak at community meetings, especially not when their employers' reputations were at stake. But something in his bearing commanded attention, a calm confidence that suggested he had something important to say. "Mr. Hartwell," he said, addressing the territorial investigator directly, "you've spent 3 days examining Mrs. Dawson's management of her ranch. What did you find?" Hartwell shifted uncomfortably, obviously preferring not to give testimony that might undermine the complaints that had brought him here. "The financial records are adequate. The operations appear profitable." "More than adequate," Lucas pressed, his voice respectful but insistent. "The ranch shows consistent profits, maintains excellent relationships with suppliers and buyers, and employs 6 men year-round in addition to seasonal help. Would you say this represents successful management?" "Success can be measured in different ways," Hartwell replied evasively. "Let me be more specific," Lucas continued, producing a folder from his jacket. "These are contracts Mrs. Dawson has negotiated over the past 3 years. Army purchases, private sales, breeding agreements. The total represents over $60,000 in business, conducted with 0 disputes or defaulted agreements. Is this the record of someone who lacks business judgment?" The dollar figures created a stir in the room. $60,000 represented serious money, proof of business acumen that couldn't be easily dismissed. Several people leaned forward with new interest, reconsidering their assumptions about Isabelle's capabilities. But Garrett wasn't finished. "Mr. Rivers, your loyalty to your employer is admirable, but surely you understand that emotional attachment might compromise your objectivity about her business decisions." The comment was designed to remind everyone of Lucas's inappropriate relationship with his employer, but he met it head-on with startling directness. "You're right that I'm not objective about Mrs. Dawson," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "I love her, and I'm not ashamed to say so publicly. But my feelings don't change the facts about her competence, and they don't give anyone the right to force her into a marriage she doesn't want." Gasps echoed through the hall at his bold declaration. Lucas had just confirmed the rumors that had been circulating for weeks, admitting openly to feelings that violated every social convention the town held sacred. "Furthermore," he continued, "I'd like to know exactly what authority Mr. Blackwood has to question Mrs. Dawson's management or interfere with her personal choices. She owns her ranch free and clear, pays her taxes, and contributes more to this community's economy than most men twice her age. By what right does anyone here presume to dictate how she should live?" The challenge hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Lucas had shifted the entire framework of the discussion, making it about individual rights rather than community standards, about legal authority rather than social pressure. It was then that the unexpected support arrived. Sarah Morrison, Frank's wife, stood with obvious nervousness but clear determination. "I'd like to say something," she announced, her voice trembling but audible. "Mrs. Dawson helped us through the worst winter of our lives 3 years ago. When Frank was laid up with pneumonia and we couldn't afford the doctor, she sent Dr. Cross to our place and paid the bill herself. When our cattle got through her fence and ate her winter feed, she never asked for compensation. That's the kind of person we're talking about running out of town." Her statement seemed to open floodgates of memory. Miguel Santos spoke about Isabelle's fairness as an Employer and her willingness to advance wages during family emergencies. Dr. Cross detailed her contributions to community welfare and her reliability in emergencies. Even Martha Kellins, clearly uncomfortable, admitted that Isabelle had always paid her bills promptly and treated her employees with respect. But the most surprising testimony came from an unexpected source. A woman Isabelle didn't immediately recognize stood near the back of the room, holding what appeared to be a carefully crafted quilt. "My name is Rebecca Donovan," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "I represent the women of Sweetwater County who've been following this situation with interest." She moved forward, the quilt draped over her arms like an offering. "We've made this as a wedding gift for Mrs. Dawson and Mr. Rivers, because we believe love should be celebrated regardless of the age of the people involved. Mrs. Donovan's parents were 20 years apart in age, married for 43 happy years. Love doesn't follow the arbitrary rules men make to control women's choices." The quilt was beautiful, a wedding ring pattern in shades of blue and gold, clearly representing hours of careful work by multiple hands. But more important than its beauty was what it represented. Support from women outside Cedar Falls, who saw Isabelle's fight as their own. "We've also taken the liberty of contacting territorial authorities about the unusual nature of this investigation," Rebecca continued. "It's remarkable how quickly governmental concern for ranch management disappears when the complainant's motives are examined closely." Garrett's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. His carefully orchestrated campaign was unraveling as community members recognized the vindictive motivations behind the legal challenges. "The question before this community isn't whether Mrs. Dawson can manage her ranch," Rebecca concluded. "She's already proven that beyond doubt. The question is whether Cedar Falls will support a neighbor's right to choose her own path, or whether you'll let one man's wounded pride destroy a good woman's life." The room erupted in discussion as people began reconsidering positions they'd thought were fixed. Isabelle felt tears of gratitude as she realized that support had been building quietly while she'd focused on the vocal opposition. The tide was turning, but the final decision still rested with authorities who might not be swayed by community sentiment alone. 6 months later, the new family photograph sat prominently on Isabelle's mantelpiece, a testament to love's ability to create family from the most unlikely circumstances. The image showed her and Lucas on their wedding day, surrounded by the ranch hands who'd become their chosen family, their faces bright with the joy of people who'd fought for happiness and won. The wedding itself had been everything she'd hoped for, simple, heartfelt, and blessed by a community that had ultimately chosen love over convention. Reverend Holbrook had performed the ceremony with obvious pleasure, his earlier discomfort forgotten in the face of overwhelming community support for the union. Even Patricia Holbrook had attended, though she'd maintained her disapproval through pursed lips and careful distance from the celebration. The territorial investigation had concluded with Morrison Hartwell's grudging admission that the Dawson Ranch was among the best-managed operations he'd encountered. Garrett Blackwood's complaint had been dismissed as unfounded, though not before his reputation suffered damage from the revelation of his vindictive motivations. He'd left Cedar Falls shortly after the wedding, selling his holdings to a cattle company from Denver and disappearing from their lives with the bitter dignity of a man whose schemes had collapsed around him. "Still can't quite believe it," Lucas said from the doorway, watching as Isabelle arranged wildflowers in the vase he'd made for her as a wedding gift. The handmade pottery was beautiful in its simplicity, glazed in shades that caught the morning light and reminded her daily of his thoughtfulness. "Which part?" she asked, turning to smile at the man who'd become her husband, her partner, and her greatest joy. "That we survived the scandal? That the ranch is more profitable than ever, or that Cedar Falls actually accepted us?" "All of it," he replied, crossing to wrap his arms around her from behind. "Sometimes I wake up and think I dreamed the whole thing, finding you, falling in love, having the town's blessing on our marriage. It seems too perfect to be real. The reality was far from perfect, but it was theirs. Their marriage had required adjustments neither had anticipated. From learning to share decision-making about ranch operations, to navigating the delicate balance between employer and spouse when dealing with the other hands. But every challenge had been met with patience and humor, their love deepening with each obstacle overcome. The ranch itself had prospered beyond their wildest expectations. Lucas's expertise with horses had attracted buyers from across the territory, while Isabelle's business acumen had expanded their operations into new markets. The Army contracts continued, but they'd also established relationships with Eastern buyers seeking quality stock for breeding programs. Their success had silenced even the most persistent critics, proving that their partnership was beneficial in practical as well as personal terms. Jeremiah knocked on the doorframe, his weathered face creased with the satisfaction of a man watching his predictions come true. "Sorry to interrupt, but we've got visitors coming up the road. Looks like that buyer from Kansas City you've been expecting." "Perfect timing," Isabelle said, straightening her dress and checking her hair in the mirror. The business of ranching continued, but now she faced each challenge with Lucas beside her, the different strengths combining to create something stronger than either could manage alone. As they walked to the porch to greet their visitor, Isabelle reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The scared widow, who'd worn Thomas's too large gloves and hidden behind the safety of routine, had been replaced by a woman confident in her own worth and unafraid to fight for what she believed in. The transformation hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. The pressed wildflower Lucas had given her still sat in its place of honor on her desk, a reminder of small kindnesses that had grown into something magnificent. They'd found the field where it came from and had picnicked there on their wedding day, surrounded by prairie roses that seemed to celebrate their happiness with nature's own confetti. "Mrs. Rivers," the buyer said as he dismounted, using her married name with the respect she'd earned through years of honest dealing. "I've been looking forward to seeing your operation. Your reputation for quality horses has reached even Kansas City." "Welcome to our ranch," she replied, the possessive pronoun carrying new meaning now that the land truly belonged to both of them. Lucas stepped forward to shake hands with their visitor, his easy confidence a reminder of how much he'd grown since arriving as a young cowboy looking for work and belonging. They spent the morning showing their horses, discussing bloodlines and breeding programs with the expertise that had made their ranch famous throughout the territory. The buyer left with agreements for 12 horses and promises to recommend their stock to other Eastern buyers. It was exactly the kind of success Isabelle had dreamed of when she'd first expanded the breeding program. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in shades of rose and gold, Isabelle felt the profound contentment of a woman who'd found her place in the world. The mountains stood eternal on the horizon, the same peaks Thomas had loved and that she'd learned to see as symbols of endurance and beauty. But now they also represented new beginnings, the endless possibilities that came with love, freely chosen and courageously defended. "Any regrets?" Lucas asked, his hand warm in hers as they shared the comfortable silence of people who'd learned to be fully present with each other. "Only that it took us so long to find each other," she replied, lifting their joined hands to kiss his knuckles. "Though I suppose we both needed to become the people we are before we could recognize what we had." "James would have been happy for us," Lucas said quietly. The first time he'd mentioned his guardian since their wedding day. He used to say that love was life's way of making sure we didn't give up on hope. Looking at this man who'd ridden into her carefully ordered world and changed everything, Isabelle knew that hope was exactly what they'd found. Hope for happiness that defied expectations, for love that transcended age and convention, for a future built on the foundation of two people who'd been brave enough to believe in each other. The photograph on the mantelpiece would fade with time, but the love it captured would only grow stronger, season by season, year by year. in the endless cycle of renewal that marked life on the frontier. They'd found their way home, not to a place but to each other, and that was the most extraordinary discovery of all.